such different sisters. The serious older one is a faithful and loving wife, a diligent mother who knew from childhood that she would be a queen, and a completely carefree, frivolous younger one. Even though the girls received exactly the same upbringing until the age of 18, when her older sister had an heir son, and then other children began to be born, Margaret was, oddly enough, the first candidate to replace Elizabeth, should anything happen. But, to her good fortune, no such sacrifice was required. How do you live your life if you have everything, if you are allowed to do almost everything, and if you have, in fact, no responsibilities? Princess Margaret, Elizabeth II's own sister, did it like a true aristocrat, as selfishly as possible. She invariably drew attention to herself by just constantly getting into scandals. The princess spent her life smoking, drinking and changing the men she loved. It's the latter that we're going to talk about. Well, why not? While the sisters looked very much alike, Margaret was lovelier than Elizabeth. She was also livelier and more direct, which added to her points. Her first great love was a man in the traditional profession for those who historically become the object of attraction for bored princesses. A stable boy. His name was Peter Woolridge Townsend. The year Margaret was born, he joined the Royal Air Force. Before becoming a royal stable boy, he was a fighter pilot and fought heroically in the Second World War, making a good career as a military pilot and commander. He joined the stables in 1944, as he was the future king's personal flying instructor in the 30s. And he held that position until 1952. He was not only in contact with the king, but also with his daughters naturally, exclusively as a servant. He was married. His first wife in 1941 was Cecile Rosemary Pole. He had 2 sons, and they were born in 1942 and 1945, that is, at the time of the events of interest to us were still young. And lo and behold, a princess fell in love with him. Peter divorced his first wife in 1952. Although according to the official version, the reason for the divorce was his wife's infidelity, and confessed their feelings for each other, Peter and Margaret, afterwards. The version is, of course, beautiful. One way or another, he became free. However, there were many buts to this whole situation. Firstly, he was the ultimate commoner. Secondly, divorce was a disadvantage. He might have had a chance to become Princess Margaret's husband if he had not been married before the whole affair. Peter, after the divorce, proposed to Margaret, but she was a minor, and in order to agree to the marriage she had to get permission from either her father, who had just died, or her older sister, who became queen, and then also from Parliament. The Church of England believed that a divorced commoner was not a suitable husband for Margaret. The Queen, as head of the church, could not ignore this position of the clergy. Everyone waited for 1955, when Margaret could decide on her own, without anyone else's permission, on her own marriage. But after reaching the age of 25, she publicly abandoned the idea of becoming Peter's wife. Princess Margaret was unwilling to give up her status as royalty and the resulting rights and privileges for the sake of a great love. And poor Peter was left with a broken heart. He lost his family, he was made a fool of, publicly, and apparently had a mental crisis after such a collapse of hopes. Before that, he was sent to work away from Margaret, at the embassy in Brussels. The man quit there and went on a round-the-world trip. And then he married an ordinary girl, a Belgian citizen, in 1959. Her name was Marie-Luce Germain, and she worked as his secretary. She was 19 years old and he was 45. Some thought she looked a lot like Princess Margaret. Anyway, the couple had 2 daughters and a son and lived together until Peter's death. And they were happy. Yes. And they met Margaret only once more after she broke off the engagement. In 1992, she invited Peter to lunch, where other people were present. They whispered all through the meal, and then Princess Margaret said sadly that Peter was still the same, only greyer. After Princess Margaret refused to marry the man she loved, she began to behave in a way that would have been far less embarrassing to the royal family if the princess had married a divorced man. She spent all her free time partying in different clubs, drinking like crazy, smoking 60 cigarettes a day and changing partners, without hiding it from the public, which was shocked. Either she was getting revenge on everyone, or she didn't care about anyone else to that extent, or she couldn't live without the scrutiny. But it wasn't normal either way. The press followed her around and constantly delighted the public, hungry for spectacle and scandal, all the new antics of the princess. She had quite a wide circle of men close to her. The public watched the series with interest. However, as the years went by, friends from her inner circle started families, and Margaret was still running around in restaurants and nightclubs. The people began to fear that she would die an old maid. Eventually, at a dinner party to celebrate her 29th birthday, she met fashion photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, the royal family's personal photographer. He photographed her that day as a member of that family. Anthony was also a commoner, like Princess Margaret's previous love. His father came from a small noble family in Wales and his mother from a Jewish family of bankers with roots in Germany. Bankers are no match for kings, you see. His entire advantage over Townsend was that Anthony had not previously been married. Her sister, the Queen, smoothed out what she could, eventually ennobling the photographer with the titles of Earl of Snowdon and Viscount Linley. She loved Margaret, and wanted her happiness very much. But she did not grant her husband the title of Duke. Apparently, for a man of such a background, it was too much. The couple dated for a year and a half and then got married after all. Princess Margaret accepted Anthony's proposal after learning that her first love, Townsend, was about to marry. In general, there are many oddities in this marriage. For example, the press, which followed Princess Margaret around and tracked her every move, never once saw a hint of any relationship between Princess Margaret and Anthony. The announcement that the princess was getting married and engaged was a surprise to everyone. The wedding was done to the highest standards, like a royal wedding. It was televised all over the world. Margaret's passion for attention was fully satisfied. By the way, her husband remained the royal photographer. No change in his status was a reason to leave that job. And then began the grey routine of family life, which turned out to be unbearable. Many believed that this strange and scandalous marriage was another act of defiance on the part of the princess. Once she was not allowed to do as she wished, but she still insisted on her own way. Very soon, both spouses began to seek solace on the side, despite having 2 children. The kids turned out cute, by the way. Well, in general, the marriage began to crack at the seams almost immediately. Married Anthony and Margaret in 1960, 4 years later the couple barely tolerated each other, 16 years later began to live separately, and in 1978 once again shocked the public divorce. That in the royal families of England has not been practiced for centuries. That's not to say Margaret hadn't changed during her years of marriage. There have been changes. If before she used to hang out only with aristocrats, now she has expanded her circle of intimates to include show business stars and representatives of creative professions. Naturally, the famous and rich. After the divorce, Princess Margaret's ex-husband continued to work as a royal photographer and always kept his mouth shut, by the way. And Princess Margaret has gone off the rails once again. She even began to be photographed without clothes. Her mornings had long since started with a shot of vodka. She smoked terribly, as well as drank, and, in general, she was not the first youth by the time of the divorce, so her lifestyle had finally undermined her health. From 1984 to the end, Princess Margaret's life entered a new stage. A stage of battling a lingering depression and a host of illnesses. She underwent lung surgery and first reduced her smoking to 30 cigarettes a day, and then, in 1991, she stopped smoking altogether but started drinking much more. Then she had a stroke. Then she somehow scalded her feet taking a bath, the official version, and got into a wheelchair for good. Then another stroke and paralysis. Anyway, she died a deeply ill and unhappy woman. A real wreck. At the age of 71. Which is nothing at all, given their usual longevity in her family.